ladies and gentlemen, we will slowly start this Simon Wiesenthal lecture tonight. Thank you. This is my pleasure and also honor to introduce Jan Gross, who is a Polish-American sociologist and a historian. I don't think so that he needs a lot of intro, but I will do it because I think it's still important. He is now professor of history emeritus at Princeton University, and he's also the author of several books on Polish history, particularly Polish-Jewish relations during World War II and the Holocaust, including The Neighbors. I have a very formative memory of The Neighbors because The Neighbors was translated into Hungarian within 6 weeks or I don't know, very, very fast. And I remember that it was also important not only for historians but sociologists to understand your method, your way of thinking, to understand local social history. And it's still a kind of very nice memory for me. Jan studied physics at the University of Warsaw, and he became one of the young dissidents known as Kommandosi, and was among the university students who participated in the March events, the Polish student and intellectual protest in 1968. Like many Polish students, he was expelled from the university and was arrested and jailed for 5 months. During the Polish communist government's anti-Semitic campaign, Gross emigrated from Poland to the United States in 1969. In 1975, he earned a PhD in sociology at Yale University for a thesis on the Polish underground state, published as Polish Society under German occupation in 1979. And Gross, maybe all of you know, has taught at Yale, but not only at Yale, at NYU and also in Paris. His 2001 book about Jedwabne massacre, Neighbors, as I mentioned, became a very, very important publication in the field of Holocaust studies and resulted in controversy and also an investigation by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance. The same happened with the second and the third book. So it's really a very interesting life trajectory, and I only mentioned a couple of episodes of this life history. But now Jan will give a lecture about reflections on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a comparison between Polish and Jewish perspectives. And I very much look forward, and thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eva, for this. We'll see. No, okay, it's okay. I can see it. I think there is plenty of light. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Just had a cataract operation, so my eyes don't function always the way I would like them to. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. The name of the patron of your institute makes me proud to be here. Thank you. In Hanna Kral's interview with Marek Edelman, To Shield the Flame, a small book that made Edelman famous, there is a brief passage that you might have missed. She asked him early on in their conversation, "Could one see anything on the Aryan side from behind the wall?" And Edelman replies, "Yes. The wall reached only to the first floor. Already from the second floor, one could see the other street. We saw the merry-go-round, we saw people, we heard music, and we were terribly afraid that this music will drown us, that these people won't be able to see anything, that nobody in the whole world will notice us, or the struggle, or the dead. That this wall is so big and that nothing, no news ever about us will get through, unquote. Edelman need have worried. The prolific underground press in German-occupied Poland, the great agora, which functioned as a key component of the clandestine movement, immediately started reporting about the Jewish armed resistance in the ghetto. Most of the underground newspapers wrote with sympathy, noting the Jews who barely a few months earlier went to their death like sheep, finally decided to die with dignity. The uprising also drew crowds of onlookers to the ghetto walls to watch the German firing positions set up outside in a huge conflagration as Germans were burning systematically entire ghetto streets to suppress the insurgency. Adolf Rudnicki, who was in Warsaw when the uprising started, described in the first issue of an excellent post-war era political literary weekly, Kuźnica, the spectacle of sympathetic onlookers surrounding SS units shooting at the Jews from the Aryan side of the wall. And I quote, German artillerymen at Krasińskich and Bonifraterska streets were loading and firing amid an approving crowd. Children patted enemies on the sleeves. Women's eyes followed the audacious runs of SS men up to the walls. One looked at this in disbelief. It had too much. The cruel fraternity lasted for one day, unquote. Later, Polish civilians could no longer approach German military positions as shots had been fired at the SS from the surrounding buildings. Crowds of spectators, nevertheless, assembled outside the walls for the duration of the fighting, including many a Jew, like Rudnicki himself, passing under a false identity on the Aryan side. At one point, he saw a young woman in the crowd choking with tears. He tried discreetly to calm her. She was in mortal danger should anyone recognize that she was Jewish. And in this crowd that surrounded us, he wrote with sadness, just as in the city at large, we had more enemies than friends, unquote. Another eminent Polish Jewish writer, the poet Mieczysław Jastrun, teaching at the time in the network of underground clandestine Polish schools, described in Odrodzenie, also a first-rate politico-cultural journal published in the immediate post-war period, he described the reactions to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising among high school students from a lower-class neighborhood in Prague, and I quote, "They just kept telling each other jokes about what was going on behind the walls," he recalled. In his article, Potęga ciemnoty, the power of ignorance, the article triggered the first wide-ranging post-war debate about Polish anti-Semitism. Jastrun also described a scene from a different part of town he had witnessed at the time, and I quote him. Young office girls poured out on a terrace of one of the largest buildings in Żoliborz neighborhood to watch from there the conflagration of the ghetto, and called out cheerfully in the spring air, shaking with detonations and reeking of smoke, "Come, look how cutlets from Jews are fried," unquote. The formulation about frying Jews became a sort of staple phrase overheard by people in Warsaw at the time. So the ghetto uprising has been immediately noticed. What else? How could the biggest conflagration in its history be missed in the middle of a large European city? And indeed drew crowds of onlookers. Truth be told, it provided a sort of mass entertainment for Warsawians during the Easter week of 1943. Yet Edelman's worry, expressed in a conversation held 30 years after the uprising, was real, although not about the uprising passing unnoticed. It was about something else. Edelman's comrade in arms and a close personal friend, Itzhak Zuckerman, Antek was his pseudonym in the underground, expresses the same sentiment in a somewhat different manner. We were persuaded, he writes in his memoirs, and this was a mistaken assumption, that, and I quote him now, the moment the world will learn about what is going on here, something important will happen. And our second mistake, the faith that our neighbors from across the wall are not aware of our fate here, and that when they become aware, this situation will change, unquote. I emphasize our fate here and what is going on here. We know from their own reminiscences that the organizers of the uprising did not attribute any special significance to their decision to put up armed resistance. Persuaded that they will be killed no matter what, they merely chose a culturally prescribed and acceptable form of death. That's how they described their course of action. And they certainly did not worry that their heroism may go unnoticed. What was on their minds, rather, was the systematic mass murder of Warsaw Jews, which began on July 22nd, 1942. The Ghetto Uprising of April 19, 1943, was but a closing coda of the so-called Gross Aktion Warsaw, in which altogether some 400,000 Jews will be killed. And the catastrophe in Warsaw was, in itself, but an episode in the ongoing deliberate mass murder of all the Jews in German-occupied Poland. This is what they worried about. How to communicate to fellow human beings that a mass murder of an entire people is in progress. We know about the inability to convey such information between intelligent and educated people, for instance, from Jan Karski's conversation with the US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Isaiah Berlin, incidentally by Oxford coincidence also Felix Frankfurter's good friend, during the war put his social skills and love of conversation at the service of the British Embassy in Washington, where he was tasked with monitoring the views of US politicians and the public opinion in America on all matters pertinent to the British war effort, including the issue of Palestine, the future of Jewish state there, and the British mandate. Isaiah Berlin had a Zionist period in his life, as you know, and he was a close confidant of Chaim Weizmann, constantly in touch with him. Berlin met everyone worth knowing in New York and Washington and talked with them incessantly about everything. And by his own admission, he did not understand what Holocaust was all about until April 1945, after the camps were liberated in Europe. In actuality, the most important audience to which organizers of Jewish resistance felt they ought to communicate this determination they made about German plans to murder all the Jews was not the world or some neighbors across the wall, but their fellow Jews who were still alive. In the struggle for survival during the Holocaust, the most important prerequisite was to be able to recognize the facts, to see with clarity what is going on, and then to absorb this knowledge. Only how? What they had to overcome, Zuckerman says, was the powerful force of illusion, as he put it. In those days, he writes, and I quote him, "It meant that if something terrible happened in Lublin, people said, well, it did, but it won't happen in Warsaw. When it happened in Warsaw, they said, okay, it happened in Nalewki Street, but it won't happen in Gęsia," unquote. And so on, and so forth. How do you convince people that what in the light of their lifetime experience is inconceivable, in fact, is actually taking place? No matter how frightening the unfolding events appeared, it still didn't make sense to interpret them as part of a deliberate mass murder of an entire nation. One could always come up with some alternative, more plausible explanation. Zuckerman came from Vilna, and he tells in his memoir, The Surplus of Memory, that he became aware that the German goal was total annihilation of the Jews after he learned about the mass killings in Ponary. Apparently, Abba Kovner, who was also at the time in Vilna, drew a similar conclusion from these killings. That would date his awareness at some time in late autumn 1941. When he talked to others about his conclusion, people objected. Germans had beef with communism, was the argument. But when they conquered the area, it turned out that the Bolsheviks ran away. Jews sympathized with the communists, and so when the Germans laid their hands on the Jews, they killed them in revenge. It is not an overall policy. It's merely circumstantial. Only when Schloime Feiner, who worked for a couple of weeks on the burial detail in Chełmno, Kulmhof, managed to escape from the death camp and showed up in January 1942 in the Warsaw Ghetto, the argument that Jews had been killed in Ponary for being communists could be rebuffed. After all, Jews murdered in Chełmno could not have been all suspected of special affiliation with communism. But the issue was never closed. I quote, "One cannot conclude the Germans have a unified prescription for dealing with the Jews," the head of the Judenrat from Ostrowiec told Zuckerman. Continue the quote. "One way or another, we are still dependent on local authorities. If we manage to have good relations with Germans locally, chances are very good that we will survive the war. Let's take as an example Radom and Kielce. In Radom, Jews are getting beaten for not taking off their caps in the street in front of the Germans. In Kielce, it's the other way around. Or take Warsaw. Closed ghettos surrounded by a wall and barbed wire, inhabitants exposed to suffering from hunger and typhus. And in Ostrowiec, an open Jewish quarter and plenty of food. How can one assume that a single German hand is in charge of and directing the entire Jewish fate?" Unquote. While Jews were trying to figure out what was in store for their community, the Polish public opinion took a stand by and large that what was happening to the Jews was of little concern to the Poles. And I do not have in mind just the anti-Semitic segment of the Polish society famously characterized by Jan Karski in this passage of his report to the government in London. And I quote, "The Jewish issue creates something like a narrow bridge when Germans meet in agreement," the word was emphasized by Karski, "with a large part of the Polish society," unquote. On the eve of the 60th anniversary of the Ghetto Uprising, shortly after a very intense discussion of Polish-Jewish relations during the war has taken place in Poland in the aftermath of publication of Neighbors, an article The evil shadow of the war appeared in the main daily newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza. Its author, Halina Bortnowska, a human rights activist and a leading Catholic intellectual associated with the weekly Tygodnik Powszechny and the publishing house Znak, paragons of open-mindedness, ecumenism, and decency, wrote what follows. And I quote, "I remember two things, not from books or recounted stories, but the way one remembers a recurring bad dream. Spring, sunlight, April clouds, dark, imposing, and swirling black snow is falling, flakes of soot. It's from the ghetto, says my mother, wiping this black snow from the windowsill, from the face, from the eyes. Of course, one could hear during the day, and especially at night, explosions and distant shooting. It was not very unusual in Warsaw at that time, but it always brought fear. It's nothing. It's in the ghetto." In the ghetto, then, meant not here, not where we are. This fire will not come here. It will not engulf my street, my courtyard. Does anybody but me still remember that we used to say, "It's nothing, it's in the ghetto"? We used to say it to each other just like that, in a tone of comforting explanation, as soldiers must reassure each other that a particular alarm is for somebody else. But today, I am ashamed of this distance. I see in it the evil shadow of the war cast over one's soul. It is as if the perpetrators of Warsaw's Holocaust managed to remove the Jews from the realm of human solidarity, and as if they managed to remove us beyond the range where we could experience it. What did they feel when the black snow was falling? Nothing. Nothing? Really? Czy naprawdę nic? Unquote. Well, there is an indirect answer to the question Bortnowska asked in the conclusion of her article, "What was I feeling when the ghetto was burning?" And it comes from Czesław Miłosz. Black petals falling from the sky figured in his poem about the Ghetto Uprising, Campo dei Fiori. Nobody could miss them in Warsaw this Easter week. When Miłosz got to be world famous after receiving Nobel Prize in Literature, he often gave poetry readings on university campuses in America, his natural audience, as he taught Slavic literatures at Berkeley for a very long time. And to the best of my knowledge, he never included Campo dei Fiori among the poems he read. This was noticeable, in part because it was perhaps his best-known poem. Maybe this irritated him, people speculated. Maybe he resented being pigeonholed as the author of this specific verse, while his opus was so immense and varied. Miłosz, in a manner of speaking, replied to Bortnowska's question in his correspondence with Jerzy Giedroyć, the editor and founder of the Emigre Monthly and a publishing house called Kultura, Culture, a venerable institution in Poland's post-war history with which the poet was associated ever since he fled Poland in 1951. In a letter written by Miłosz on August 1st, 1979 to Giedroyć, we find this one sentence. Ja całe życie nie mogę się podźwignąć, bo uczciwy człowiek powinien był pójść do warszawskiego getta i tam zginąć. For my entire life, I cannot put myself together, because an honest person should have gone to the Warsaw Ghetto and died there." Unquote. No wonder he couldn't bear to bring up the memory of this catastrophe casually, as it were, doing some poetry reading at the campus of an American university. Of course, the two kinds of memorialization, dismissal, elision, suppression, as per Bortnowska's reminiscence, and the avowed trauma which these recollections bring up, as per Miłosz's letter, are not at all contradictory. One needn't specialize in psychoanalysis to know that they go hand in hand. The well-known mechanism of suppression of traumatic experiences notwithstanding, I am still flabbergasted at the turning away from the catastrophic mass murder of the Jews, the disinterest displayed among the Poles. Allow me to bring a personal recollection to sharply delineate the point. I belong to the generation of 68ers, student protesters whose activities in various countries culminated around 1968. Things in Poland blew up in March of that year. But we were a precocious and unruly bunch already for a couple of years before, while still in high school. In 1962, at the initiative of Adam Michnik, who would later become an intellectual, internationally recognized figure of Polish politics and intellectual life, we set up a discussion club, as was by then a tradition of Warsaw's intelligentsia. Only we were very young. We were very young. One of the nicknames we got stuck with was Klub Raczkujących Rewizjonistów, the club of crawling, in the sense of crawling babies, Marxist revisionists. We organized meetings and held discussions on a whole variety of subjects, about the Gulag, about Russian dissident poets and their protest songs, about the workers' cooperatives in Yugoslavia, or about the Spanish Civil War, or more esoteric issues, such as what is society. Anything, really, especially when we felt the government censorship or the silence of our parents' generation kept us from knowing the truth about the subject. We never held in our club a discussion about the Holocaust. I do not recall a single important conversation with any of my friends on the subject of the Shoah. And we were reading and talking history constantly. And most of us were Jewish. Why? I cannot tell you. I do not understand this in retrospect. On the face of it, because this was not an interesting subject. Because it seemed so clear-cut and transparent. The Germans have killed the Jews. Period. Nothing really to talk about. Nobody seemed to be hiding anything. No censorship, we thought, was imposed by the communist authorities on how the issue was narrated. What an astonishing ignorance and naivete on the part of youth committed to leave no stone unturned in the search of dirty laundry hidden by their parents' generation. And the incriminating evidence of state-sponsored lies concerning the fate of Jews during the war was displayed in plain sight. For example, in the flagship State Museum of German Atrocities at the Auschwitz concentration camp, in those days still called Oświęcim, where all were invited to see a big and elaborate exhibit without the word Jew anywhere to be found. I do not recall when I read Miłosz's volume Ocalenie. I was still in high school. It may have been, though, after the authorities dissolved our club. Stunning verses about the war and the fate of Jews, including Campo dei Fiori, which for educated Poles immortalized the Ghetto Uprising, freezing the merry-go-round and playful crowds under the ghetto walls in a canonic image of distanced estrangement. In Rome, on the Campo dei Fiori, baskets of olives and lemons, cobbles spattered with wine, and the wreckage of flowers. Vendors covered the trestles with rose-pink fish, armfuls of dark grapes heaped on peach down. On the same square, they burned Giordano Bruno. Henchmen kindled the pyre close pressed by the mob. Before the flames had died, the taverns were full again, baskets of olives and lemons again on the vendors' shoulders. I thought of the Campo dei Fiori in Warsaw by the Sky Carousel one clear spring evening to the strains of a carnival tune. The bright melody drowned the salvos from the ghetto wall, and couples were flying high in the cloudless sky. At times, wind from the burning would drift dark kites along, and riders on the carousel caught petals in midair. That same hot wind blew open the skirts of the girls, and the crowds were laughing on that beautiful Warsaw Sunday. Someone will read as moral that the people of Rome or Warsaw huggle, laugh, make love, as they pass by the martyrs' pyres. Someone else will read of the passage of things human, of the oblivion born before the flames have died. But that day, I thought only of the loneliness of the dying, of how when Giordano climbed to his burning, he could not find in any human tongue words for mankind, mankind who live on. Already they were back at their wine or peddled their white starfish, baskets of olives and lemons they had shouldered to the fair, and he already distanced as if centuries had passed, while they paused just a moment for his flying in the fire. Those dying here, the lonely, forgotten by the world, our tongue becomes for them the language of an ancient planet. Until, when all is legend and many years have passed, on a new Campo dei Fiori, rage will kindle at a poet's word. I did not understand until years have passed that in our oblivion to the subject of the Holocaust, we were not much different from the laughing crowds on the carousel next to the ghetto walls. As to rage that the poet's words were supposed to kindle, Miłosz's did when it all became legend, but not necessarily in the way he intuited they would. A spirited discussion erupted in Poland's opinion-making newspapers and magazines on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Ghetto Uprising. Was the said merry-go-round, the Sky Carousel, caruzela in Polish, functional or in disrepair at Easter time in 1943? Or did the poet superimpose the existence of a fairground near the ghetto walls at some previous time and mistakenly describe the functioning carousel during the Ghetto Uprising? From the length and high pitch of arguments by interlocutors, occasionally bearing professorial titles, one would think that quite a chunk of national self-esteem was riding on the state of repair of this piece of fairground equipment. Miłosz did make a mistake. Various people, independently of the stanza in his poem, noted the existence of the merry-go-round in operation and recorded it in writing. The poet was well familiar with the place. As it lay adjacent to a tramway line, he took frequently across town to visit his then best friend, incidentally, another great Polish writer, Jerzy Andrzejewski, who wrote a canonic prose text in Polish literature about the Ghetto Uprising, the short story, Easter Week. This désintéressement in the Holocaust, carried over well into the post-war period, was but an illusory suppression of a dormant and deeply troubling issue that after decades unexpectedly burst into public awareness. When communism fell in East Central Europe during the miraculous year, Annus Mirabilis, 1989, and then the Soviet Union dissolved, local societies regained sovereignty and proceeded to freely organize their politics. They also, presumably, in this historical moment regained their pasts. Subjugated for decades under Communist Party censorship, peoples were now free to study previously inaccessible state archives, files of the secret police, and Communist Party documents in their respective countries. There was, among the intelligentsia in any case, a filled with curiosity suspense, a collective holding of breath as to what new facts about the communist era the perusal of kept under lock and key archives might yield. And, if you will, nothing. It turned out that there were no real skeletons hidden in the closets as far as the period of the communist rule was concerned. No big secrets unearthed. No as yet unaired misdeeds of the communists brought to the surface. Nothing that would shed radically new light on significant episodes of contemporary history. At most, the opening of secret police archives led to a slew of personal reputations destroyed when it was revealed that some public figure had not owned up to the fact that he or she at some point in the past was a secret police collaborator. A pretty mild stuff, you will agree, as far as reinterpretation of history is concerned. Simultaneously, however, it began to surface, this took a few years to bleed into the public domain, that the unfolding secret, the difficult past in Eastern Europe, one that had not been worked through or even narrated in accordance with facts, the still to come East European Vergangenheitsbewältigung, was the Second World War and the German occupation of the region. One aspect in particular was blowing up the accepted clichés, which rooted the sense of collective identity of the local people in a narrative about the suffering and persecution experienced at the hands of the communists or the fascists. The untold story of complicity of the local population in the extermination of the Jews. This has been, it turned out, the real skeleton rattling in the closets of 20th century East European societies. In what way did the world outside the walls exist for the Jews? Did it embody hope? Anka Grupińska asked Marek Edelman in a conversation held sometime in the 1980s. It was an enemy, Edelman replied. And I continued to quote. Because an enemy is not only the one who is killing you, but also the one who is oblivious to your fate. Not to help or to kill amounts to the same thing, unquote. Edelman, as those who knew him would readily, I think, acknowledge, did not shy from controversial statements. And he could be rather coarse and direct in response to questions. But while this might have sounded tough and typical Edelman at the time he gave the answer, in light of what we know today as a result of 2 decades of amazing writings by the so-called New Polish School of Holocaust Research, his statement is very much on the ball. Only it leaves out the most important part of the story. By merely speaking about oblivion to the German persecution of the Jews, it does not even attempt to spell out what the surrounding population did to their Jewish fellow citizens. I am hovering continuously over the phrase, it's nothing, it's in the ghetto, to make us reflect on attitudes, perceptions, and last but not least, behavior of the non-Jews confronted with the mass murder of the Jews during the Shoah. And for historians of the Holocaust, in whose profession the term bystanders has such a purchase, the findings of the new Polish School of Holocaust Research call for another look at our subject matter. It may seem hardly conceivable nowadays, when books about various aspects of the Holocaust are published in abundance, that the mass murder of European Jews was in post-war decades a subject initially shunned by scholars. The reasons for it, undoubtedly, had to do with the difficulty of contemplating the enormity of crimes committed, but also, I suspect, with the reluctance to confront different shades of complicity in Nazi-engineered evil by peoples and institutions in German-occupied Europe. With elegant restraint, in his magisterial study, Scholl Friedlander put it thus, and I'm quoting him: "Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. Some of the Christian churches declared that converted Jews were part of their flock, up to a point. To the contrary, many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for their wholesale disappearance. Thus, Nazi and related anti-Jewish policies could unfold to their most extreme levels without the interference of any major countervailing interests." This last sentence has been emphasized by the author. For much of the war, another eminent historian of this period had written, "Europeans fell into line and contributed what the Germans demanded anyway. After 1945, this was conveniently forgotten," unquote. I'm quoting this time from Mark Mazor's Hitler's Empire, How the Nazis Ruled Europe. This, I presume, must have had initially a chilling effect on academic engagement with the Shoah, and it took a noticeable time before extermination of the Jews emerged as a widely pursued subject of scholarly research. When Raoul Hilberg decided to write his doctoral dissertation at Columbia University in New York in the 1950s, it would become the founding classic in Holocaust studies, the destruction of the European Jews. His academic advisor, Franz Neumann, like Hilberg, an exiled Austrian Jew and an early student of Nazi totalitarianism, warned him that with such a topic for a PhD thesis, he stood little chance of getting a university appointment. Against considerable skepticism of fellow academics, Hannah Arendt, for instance, in a rare lapse of judgment, advised Princeton University Press to turn it down. Hilberg's book finally came out in 1961 at a small publisher, Quadrangle Books, thanks to a subsidy of a private benefactor. Once academic research on the destruction of European Jewry was set in motion, the subject was framed as a confrontation between Jews and Germans. To be sure, the German organized mechanisms and apparatus of destruction was the kernel of the mass killing process. But it was also becoming clear to scholars that the local context mattered. Jews lived for centuries enmeshed in European societies, and they had to be extricated therefrom in order to be put or sent to death. Clearly, to conceptualize the intricacy of the process, a third term, encompassing the role of other actors in addition to Jews and Germans, was needed to move the discussion forward. It was once again Hilberg who came up with a felicitous suggestion. In 1992, he published Perpetrators, Victims, Bystanders, The Jewish Catastrophe, 1933-1945. And while the book's content did not generate overwhelming interest, the title of the book, indeed one word from the title, made a phenomenal career. Bystanders, became a staple of Holocaust historiography's vocabulary, feeling the need for the third term, as it were. Hilberg's accomplishment was to name the fact, which was generally recognized as pertinent to better understanding the mechanics of the Holocaust, or simply to producing a full description of what has been going on. This in itself was a very important service, which Pierre Nora calls mettre le nom sur la chose, put a name on the thing. But I suspect that Hilberg's term was so felicitous not only because it filled the recognized gap in the description of a historical phenomenon, but also because it disarmed the deeply troubling potential that such a full description might carry. For the next step, after recognizing that in addition to Jews and Germans, the surrounding local society played a role in the process, was to ask the question, what, being the third element on the scene of the Holocaust in one's own country, did entail? What did we do when confronted with the persecution of the Jews? The term bystanders implied that we didn't do much. It merely acknowledged the fact of being there and suggested this was inconsequential. Bystanders' role, after all, is more innocuous than even that of a witness who already by definition is not implicated. Far from me to suggest that Hilberg intended to portray non-Jewish neighbors as entirely oblivious to the fate of the Jews. Actually, he had a strangely activist understanding of who the bystanders were and what they were doing. Suffice it to mention some of the chapter titles from the section on bystanders in his book. Helpers, gainers, the Jewish rescuers, alongside a title heading the churches or neutral countries. Quite a mishmash, and a few counterintuitive choices. One wouldn't think of what helpers or gainers or rescuers were doing as emblematic of standing by. But the term was untethered from the use he had made of it, and its popularity stemmed from its etymology. And we know today that it was bad history, a misnomer of what had actually happened. So with time, historians began to question the concept. What could it mean to be a bystander when confronted with radical violence to which the Jews during the Holocaust were subjected, especially in Eastern Europe? Is standing by a fitting characterization of what local people and institutions were mostly doing? Enough has been written about the contribution of the Vichy administration in France to the roundups and deportations of Jews, or the role of Hungarian gendarmerie in the summer 1944 mass deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, or about the killings of Jews carried out by auxiliary police formations staffed by locals in the East to induce a critical evaluation of the concept. Today, in tune with the earlier quoted passage from Friedlander and new monographs compiling supporting evidence, scholars would be inclined to recognize terms such as implicated subjects, facilitators, and or beneficiaries as a far more apt characterization of the contribution to the destruction of European Jews by the surrounding population. And historians are beginning to view the Shoah in all its complexity as a European phenomenon, with identifiable consequences for the remaining local population as well. A distinguished psychiatrist and a philosopher of culture, I would also call him a brilliant social historian, Professor Andrzej Leder, wrote in a flagship periodical of the new Polish School of Holocaust Research in the yearly Zagłada Żydów, Holocaust of the Jews, an important article entitled Consequences of the Shoah for Polish Social Consciousness and Unconsciousness. Leder is interested in the impact of the Holocaust as a, and I quote him, widespread and drastic phenomenon. Unquote. The melting pot, which the post-war Polish society represented, following border shifts, population transfers, and massive wartime casualties, brought together people from previously isolated local communities, he writes, with one common shared experience, however, that of the Holocaust. And I quote him now. Everybody knew what happened then in their vicinity. Everybody remembered where they had lived before the Jews got killed and where they lived thereafter. The remembrance of violence suffered and inflicted is a crucial element in the structuring of every traditional community. One often hears arguments that this did not destroy social bonds within the ethnically Polish Catholic society because Jews were considered strangers. But I do not believe this is correct. Drastic, open and massive violation of rules of social interaction, including the principle thou shalt not kill, impacts people not only at the level of consciously processed experience, rationalized and categorized according to available narratives and socially accepted myths, such as antisemitism. Scenes of murder, rape and humiliation pierce into a person's psyche and begin to influence a human being independently of what one thinks about them. And such transgressions took place wherever the Jews resided, which means across the entire southern, eastern, and central Poland. The experience of living through such an out-of-the-ordinary state of emergency leaves a feeling that it may always return, and that someday, without prior warning, one's neighbors can proceed to murder or denounce people bringing about their death, unquote. Taking stock of Jewish testimonial writings and the recent crop of historical monographs, a great contemporary Polish novelist, Szczepan Twardoch, wrote in a similar vein, and I quote him, I am convinced that one of the foundations of what one may call a shared Polish identity or ethnic consciousness is the deeply repressed knowledge about all the evil that Poles committed against Jews during the war. False consciousness leads to suffering. What is repressed will anyway come to the surface sooner or later and reveal the shameful quality of invented heroism and sainthood. Poland suffers from false consciousness, unquote. And it does not help that the ruling Polish regime from 2015 to 2023 was actively engaged in falsification of the Holocaust by promoting a mendacious narrative that Poles, as a rule, extended help to their Jewish neighbors during the war. This was not the case, unfortunately. Those who helped were rare and ostracized and endangered in their own communities. For most Poles, including superbly educated members of the so-called liberal intelligentsia, Holocaust is a chapter of history that affected somebody else. And therefore it is not conceived as a component part of mainstream Polish history. Every 5 years, the Polish Historical Association organizes its largest professional meeting, the General Assembly of Polish Historians, Powszechny Zjazd Historyków Polskich. And until its last meetings in 2024 in Białystok, when a separate panel on the subject had been held, it has never programmed a session dedicated to the discussion of the Holocaust. Holocaust is understood by the Poles as something that has happened to them and not to us. How can a violent man-induced sudden death of 3 million Polish citizens, and nearly half of them had been killed in situ, in or close to their places of residence, in full view, and with occasional participation of fellow citizens, how such a calamity extended in time over roughly 3.5 years long enough to sink into the hearts and minds of assorted beneficiaries, facilitators, implicated subject, and also, yes, most of the bystanders, how such a calamity may be anything but a core event of the 20th century Polish history. So what that the Jews, before being killed, had been locked up in the ghettos? The majority of those ghettos were easily accessible, open, at most separated from the rest of a town's population with some rickety fence or a stretch of barbed wire. And even when encircled by a wall, wasn't it the case, as an important witness of these events, Ludwig Hering had written, that getto żyło Warszawą, Warszawa żyła gettem. Każdy wiedział o tym, każdy z tego korzystał. Warszawa żyła gettem jeszcze długo po jego śmierci, aż do własnego końca. Getto było sercem Warszawy. W ciągłym pulsowaniu przyjmowało i wydzielało. The ghetto lived off Warsaw. Warsaw lived off the ghetto. Everyone knew this. Everyone profited from it. Warsaw lived off the ghetto long after its death, until Warsaw's own end. The ghetto was Warsaw's heart. In constant pulsation it received and it gave out. Jews made up 1/3 of pre-war Poland's small town and city residents, which is another way of saying that as a result of the Holocaust, 1/3 of Poland's urban population was wiped out. And because of unequal territorial distribution of the Jews, in a myriad of townships in central and eastern Poland, this meant half, or more than half of the population. This mass murder of 3 million Polish Jews, or Jewish Poles, however you like to put it, provided the rest of the Polish society with a springboard to social mobility. It involved takeover of material property on a gigantic scale and an immediate social advancement for hundreds of thousands of Polish families. From the perspective of a social historian, the conviction that the destruction of Polish Jewry happened to them and not to us, such an externalization of the Holocaust, requires as an underpinning a very peculiar mental framing of historical phenomena. It would be as if the French people espoused the belief, because victims of the terror came predominantly from the aristocracy, that the French Revolution was an episode pertinent exclusively to the history of the French nobility. Pace, it's nothing, it's in the ghetto. On the upcoming 82nd anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, at the time of the Russian war against Ukraine, William Faulkner's ditto, that the past is never dead, it is not even past, acquires special resonance. And if history of the Holocaust teaches us anything, it is that no ghetto walls or state boundaries can insulate fellow Europeans from co-responsibility for the sufferings of a civilian population subjected to murderous violence by armed aggressors. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Jan, for this sometimes very poetic, sometimes also ironic presentation, or may I say performance in the good, very good sense. So it's not easy to start a discussion about the presentation, but I would like to go back to Edelman and Zuckerman just for a while, because you started your talk with these two guys.
Yes.
And I think forgetting, it's really a danger, and as far as we can somehow revoke the memory of these guys, then we can maybe learn something also from the story. So I think not all of the participants or the audience know how old they are, where, so what was the a very concrete local situation of these two young men? And as I see that you don't like these fashionable categories like agency, so I will not use this word agency, but still I wanted to ask you, so if we want to understand the position of Edelman and the position of Zuckerman, what can we say about these two
well,
very sympathetic
as
guys?
you just said, they were very young guys. They were members of youth organizations, of Jewish youth organizations. Edelman was a Bundist. Very young, he was, I think, 20 at the time. Maybe missing it by 1 or 2 years, I'm not sure. Zuckerman may have been a few years older, but he was a leader of a Zionist youth organization, the Rohr. And they were in the Warsaw Ghetto, both of them, living there, with a bunch of their colleagues, of course, and 300,000 to 400,000, that depends on when you look at the numbers, Jews. And at a certain point, they established an underground organization. There was always, from day one in a way, a resistance built up in the ghetto in a variety of ways. Resistance in the sense of NGOs, if you wish, self-organization, creation of space and institutions that alleviated the extraordinarily brutal and exploitative economic and political oppression that Germans have instituted against the Jews. And they were involved in it from the very beginning in some ways. But at some point, actually in 1943, I'm sorry, it starts in when the Grossaktion Warschau begins in July of 1942. Then they meet and decide to set up a combat unit, a kind of a Jewish fighting organization, Job it would be called. I mean, these two guys were two of the leading members of it. I mean, there were several very important figures there, and but it's really miraculous that the two of them plus another extraordinarily important and very articulate person. She wrote memoirs afterwards and was speaking up on the issue. Zivia Lubetkin, who was the wife, who became the wife of Zuckerman, that they all survived and were able to tell the story, as it were. Very unusual and sort of unexpected coincidence, if you wish. But we know a lot thanks to it. And their testimonies are crucial for our sense of life and resistance and death in the ghetto.
And if we go further, because your strategy, if I'm not wrong, was to make a kind of parallel reading, so to read together the different protagonists of the scene, the inside on the ghetto and outside of the ghetto, and then a very radical or drastic conclusion that this is in the ghetto, it is nothing, this is in the ghetto. So this is the conclusion of these This is the
title of the piece.
Yes,
Bortnowska wrote,
but it's
and she wonders at it herself. She's a wonderful woman.
It brings us really very, very close to the experience of these generations. So the population in Warsaw.
Yeah.
And so for me, it is still unimaginable because we are reading, we are speaking on 400,000 persons in the ghetto, and oh yes. So my question is, how can we take other pieces and other pieces and other pieces, or this parallel reading, to find an answer to this question? Why it is nothing because it is in the ghetto? So why we can establish this type of imaginary of a reality? So we are there, we are neighbors, we are absolutely on the same corner, and it can be still invisible for us because it is in the ghetto. So what do you think about it? Because you read thousands of texts, so somehow compiling these perspectives you mentioned in your title.
In a way, I don't think that such a construction, in other words, building up a sense that we don't share the destiny, that we are different than them, so to speak. This is not something that's very difficult or to accomplish, or very surprising, given that these were two communities that were in a very intense conflict, at least rhetorically, but also politically, since before the war. Anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, not only in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe as well, before the war was a very prominent element of people's consciousness and political ideologies of a variety of movements. There was also in Poland an incredibly intense promotion of this Weltanschauung, which was carried out by the Catholic Church. So the sense of estrangement, as it were, it doesn't surprise me. It's to a lot of people, to Bortnowska herself, to others who lived through this period, what is so striking is that there was a common oppressor in a way. Because the whole formula of German occupation in the East, eastward of Germany, was one that carried with it an extreme cruelty and brutality which was directed towards all categories of people there. I mean, the Slavs were viewed as subhuman. They were still human, so to speak, as opposed to Jews who were considered to be on that racial hierarchy, just the very bottom. And they, as we know, this was also a process. It took time. They didn't come with this idea in 1939. But as of 1941, I think, Nazis have made the decision to kill all the Jews, and slowly proceeded to do so. So, in any case, the sense that the common oppressor doesn't generate a solidarity of some sort. But again, this is not so surprising, because if you look at the way in which such entities like concentration camps function, not only in German concentration camps, but in the Soviet Union, for example, and I'm sure it's the same in China, it's enough to give a little privilege to a certain category of prisoners, in other words, to a certain category of those who are subjected and repressed to, by the apparatus of the oppressor. And they become willing actors in the process of destroying, so to speak, the ones who are even lower than they are on the in the hierarchy established by the perpetrators. So, on one hand, there should be solidarity of victims. We are all victims, and there were elements of that in the, if you wish, in the mental world of that was in the Polish population. It was registered in. There was this underground press. It was really proliferating. The resistance was widespread and very varied. And one of the themes that you can notice in the writings was a view that we are going to be next. The Germans are now doing what they are doing to the Jews, but they will come for us in the next round. Still, it didn't generate solidarity. No?
Okay. I will open soon the Q&A section for the audience, but I want to touch upon another question, which was the second part of your presentation, and somehow it also connects, I think, this question or this hesitation we have about the cognitive dissonances between Poles and Jews. And this is exactly the silence you mentioned in Michnik and Milosz and the others, and your communist reading group. What was the name of the group? I forgot it. So it was not Marxist. Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. It's sorry. No, it's really shame for me. So for me, it is a kind of absence of a topic or absence of an emotion.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not silence in a way. 2 weeks ago, Hanna Polingali was here and gave a lecture about Yiddish language and how the Yiddish language changed a lot after the Shoah because some words appeared in this new language and helped a lot to somehow communicate about this, about the secret or about the silence, about the joint tragical experience. So my question is, because I think this is a very special East European phenomena, and maybe also in France it was the same, that the second generation had these difficulties to touch upon the fate of the parents. So what do you think? So how you want to connect this first generation, this beautiful Edelman, Zuckerman story, with the second generation? So how can these two generations now communicate with each other? They couldn't communicate with each other, but maybe now we can do something to bring these two generations together. So what happened? Why Milosz and Michnik and the others didn't want to touch upon?
No, Miłosz spoke about this.
Yes.
He wrote beautiful poems about this. It was us, my generation. Yeah. We had absolutely no ear. We didn't hear. We didn't understand. We had no sense that something strange and something, enormous has happened. I cannot intelligently tell you why. One could say, oh, it's some sort of a suppression. But I've known, I can tell you about my own family. I come from a mixed background. My father was Jewish, my mother was not. By Nuremberg criteria, so to speak. He came from an assimilated Jewish family, but Jewish. He was circumcised. He was And he spent all his life, including the wartime period, in Warsaw. He had a very distinct Jewish look. He had to hide. He never went to the ghetto. He was hiding. At first, he spent time in the East, where under the Russian rule, so to speak. At the beginning of the war, Hitler and Stalin were very good friends, and one of the accomplishments that they had done together was to divide Poland in half, really. And so there was a period until the outbreak of the German-Soviet war in June of 1941, where you could kind of, it wasn't easy, but you could relocate and find yourself under Soviet rule, as it were, in Poland, rather than under German rule. This is where my father was. Wasn't easy, but at least there were no Germans there. And then they came, and he kind of moved to Warsaw, but had to hide because of his looks. And there was never in the family a kind of suppression of conversation on the subject matter. The first husband of my mother, for example, who had been killed during the war, together with his brother and his parents. This was a Jewish family, but one that converted several generations earlier to Protestantism. So, forgive me for giving you such details, but it mattered. He wasn't circumcised, so he couldn't be identified easily in that way. And he and his brother were deeply involved in the Polish underground. So they had fantastic papers, documents, everything.
Schutzpass, you mean?
Pardon me?
Schutzpass or something.
Yes, Karta it was called. In any case, so they were denounced. They were denounced by we don't know exactly whom, but okay. So there were Jews who had been denounced. Such was the state of mind of my generation, and in some strange way, the state of mind of my parents too. The milieu of Warsaw's intelligentsia, this is my supposition, didn't know very well what was going on between Jews and Poles. Yeah. I had a fantastic rapport with my parents. My mother during the war and her first husband, they were deeply involved in the underground work. They were in the Home Army, in the propaganda department of the Home Army. So all the information, anyway, they knew presumably everything. But it turns out that they didn't. I mean, my mother, I never had a sense that there is a topic that we cannot broach.
Yes, but if we go a bit deeper and look this subculture,
but it's so suppressed that we don't know what it is.
I'm not a psychoanalyst,
yes.
but I think so as your parents were part of a kind of radical resistance movement, it produces a kind of culture.
Yeah.
And you, as a second generation, suddenly found yourself in the group of the democratic opposition.
Yeah.
It's not a big surprise for me.
Yeah.
So I think this is this hidden culture which maybe somehow still there.
I don't understand. I think we are complete idiots. I mean, not to understand that there was something very fishy about the way Jewish faith played out in Poland, and to really rest content with the understanding that, so to speak, Germans killed the Jews, which in a fundamental way is true, of course, but it doesn't begin to address the issue of how these European societies dealt with them. Mm-hmm. We completely there were a lot of smart people in that group, to start with Adam. Yeah, we really had other business. Our business was with various lies of the communists, essentially.
A kind of resistance.
Yeah.
Good. We still have a couple of minutes for questions and comments. So, who wants to start? Jochen. Do we have a mic? Okay. Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Gross, for this fascinating lecture. I'm still under the influence. But I wanted to ask you, because you have touched the topic yourself, that the propaganda of the former Polish government was very much playing the card of Poles who also rescued Jews, no? and the righteous amongst the nation. And I think what we badly need are figures from a sociological point of view. You are a sociologist, and you also mentioned the new school of Holocaust studies with brilliant colleagues like Barbara Engelking and Jan Ljorzak and others that you know very well. Is there any hope that we can see some figures that put into relations what percentage of the population was actively taking part in killing Jews, and what percentage of the population was actively taking part in rescuing Jews? Do you see there any hope that we would put these into relation?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure. I should say, I'm pretty sure that we'll never get any numerical grasp of this. But it doesn't mean that we are helpless, because one can observe social practices and certain social phenomena that take place that inform us about a kind of, if you will, frequency, since this is what you asked. What I have in mind is, for example, as it concerns people who are helping Jews during the war, there's plenty of testimonies to this effect by Jews who survived, for example, or also by rescuers who are active in a kind of a more public capacity, not simply as people who are hiding someone, but as organizers. I have in mind, for example, Irena Sendlerova, on whom an important book has been written. People who rescued, who were hiding Jews, were pariahs in Polish society. They were ostracized. If the information about them having hidden Jews came out, they would be endangered in their own communities. So one of the bizarre phenomena that, if you come to it unprepared, that you encounter is that when war ends, it's a rule rather than the exception for those who are hiding Jews to say, please, to their wards. Don't mention it to anybody. And this gives you a good grasp. I mean, you don't need to have numbers. You know that these are very, very minute, very small numbers. People. And then the more we dig into it, there is a widespread sort of social practice of persecuting them, of punishing them in a way. You know, the Polish underground was extraordinarily vicious towards those Poles who were helping out Jews. Documenting this is not very complicated. Very few were helping out. There was no norm that sustained it, except, of course, for Christian ethics, which says that you should help people. And many did because of that. For instance, the whole story of Jedwabne, which was able to reconstruct. It came into public domain, so to speak, because a woman who, as Anna Bikont, who later on befriended her and spent a lot of time with her, and Anna Bikont is a wonderful journalist and historian, in fact, in Poland, who followed up on the Jedwabne story. A woman, her name was Antonina Wyrzykowska, who hid, with whom was hiding the man Szmul Wasserstein, whose testimony was the crucial trigger of, first of all, my curiosity. I mean, I should say, first of all, this was a trigger of a later trial that took place in 1949 in Poland. He revealed this story. Anyway, this was a very simple person, and as Ania Bikont put it in describing her, Antosia, that was her name, diminutive, when she doesn't work, she prays. She was a deeply devoted Catholic. And this repeats itself in testimonies of people from all over, that they suddenly found rescue from profoundly believing individuals. That's one of the characteristics. There are others. I'm not going to. But how many people have went after Jews? Again, you know, we can tell by there are a number of distinct episodes, such as Jedwabne, for example, but many other little towns in the vicinity over there. These were public events. There were masses of people who behaved in that manner. There is no norm that says, except for this very general principle of catechism that of course can be invoked, but in fact it isn't. But it was a very general phenomenon.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think the concept, the newer concept of bystanders, which was brought in by Hilberg, but for the Polish history was researched by Leder, I think is a very important concept. And I think it explains a lot. And there is also a new study, you have certainly heard about, Jan Borowicz. He's a psychoanalyst in Poland, and he wrote a research about film. That was his first approach, and he started the whole the book with a photograph of a little town in Poland, on a street, and you see peasants in the background, and in the foreground you see the SS men and a very religious Jew with the, how do you call the pious? Yeah, but I don't know the English word for it. Sidelocks,
yes.
Pious. And the SS men were just cutting the sidelocks, and in the background were standing those peasants, and one sees a woman, a peasant woman with a child on her hand, and they were both smiling and enjoying the whole situation. And so he starts his study about bystanders, also in films, and he's also describing this scene, what you mentioned about the carousel near the wall, near the ghetto wall. And I think we should we should try to find out more about the bystanders and the profiteers. And the other thing which I wanted to say is what you mentioned and what you asked about the second generation. I don't think that's right to generalize that in this way, because I think there was, like you said, also in your family, there was a lot of talk in the families, but there were many reasons why you didn't go out with that. Also fears. And it was, I mean, like you said, it was not so easy to say in Poland that one was Jewish. Nearly everybody with Jewish names changed their names in post-war Poland. And in certain situations when they attacked Michnik and I don't know whom, they always mentioned in the newspaper their Jewish names. They didn't say, those are Jews in '68, but they said, Michnik, and in brackets they say, I don't know his Jewish name, I forgot it. And I think it's that this is also a very, very important.
Yeah. There are lots of issues. I'm not going to tackle them even yet. But
I also don't want to generalize something about silence or absence. Okay, I think it can be the very last question. Oh no, two. Okay, we have two more questions. Maybe we can collect them.
Yeah, thank you very much for your impressive lecture. I have two questions. Maybe the second one is too broad, but I'm only an art historian focusing on National Socialism. So
this is the best thing in the world. I mean, my second life.
My first question would be concerning the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, how you would describe the relationship to the Ghetto Uprising. I would be interested in that, because I guess it's important, right, also for the idea of the perspectives of non-Jewish Poles living in Warsaw at the time of the Ghetto Uprising. And my second question would be, what would you say, what can we learn about the Austrian society of bystanders from your analysis of the Polish society?
You know, concerning the uprising, I'm not, in some ways you might say that there is no relationship between the one uprising and the other, except that they have taken place, of course, in the same city. If you want to, there are aspects of the treatment of Jews during the uprising, during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, which are interesting. I mean, in the sense, I'm not sure if it doesn't have much to do with the Ghetto Uprising of 1943, except that a few people, for example, such people like Zuckerman and Edelman, would participate in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. They survived, and they joined in combat. But when the Warsaw Uprising collapsed and the underground surrendered to the Germans and went into captivity, the commander of Edelman's unit told him, you know, I can't guarantee your safety. When you walk out, somebody of your comrades in arms here may denounce you as a Jew. So Edelman and Zuckerman and Lubetkin, they all stayed in Warsaw, and I don't know whether you've seen the film Pianist. You may have. So this is what happened to them too. They stayed in Warsaw even though all the population had to be evacuated, and well, survived when the Russians came. So there is a very pronounced anti-Semitic tinge. At the same time, there will be parts, there will be certain segments of the insurgents which have taken in Zuckerman and Edelman and Lubetkin, and they fought alongside, so to speak. On the other hand, and there are episodes in which Jews who were coming out of hiding would be assassinated, would be killed by the insurgents.
So the very, very last two questions
sorry.
we have to collect. No.
And about my second question?
Yes. Forgive me.
Sorry, but we have two more.
Just give me a hint.
Yeah.
Remind me, what was the second?
The comparison with the German and Austrian.
Oh, this is such a complex issue. This is you know, Opa was not a Nazi. I mean, this is the yes. In occupied Europe, it's something different because, as we discussed it, the whole population is victimized, and what do you do? And here, it's just a question of parsing out responsibility and finding a kind of a comfortable perspective which would say that only Gestapo and SS were involved in persecution of the Jews, which is, of course, not true. There was a big scandal, as you may recall or have heard about the so-called Wehrmacht exhibit, the exhibit on the participation of regular soldiers in it. Of course, there was a vast involvement of German society and Austrian society in the atrocities and the tolerance of atrocities.
Thank you for your amazing lecture today, Professor Gross. My question is much more related to the last one, and it was directed to the bystanders in Ukraine. And if you can relate to Omer Bartov's last books, which was I believe presented here 3 years ago.
You know, Buchach?
Book. What was the title?
Yeah, it was.
It was not the biography, but this tale.
From Galicia.
The tale from Galicia.
Yeah. I think the topic was much, but the topic was very related. And the second question, the short one, is if you also been through the documents from the participants of Armia Krajova, and if you can tell us something about the anti-Semitism, or how do they perceive the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto? Because what I as far as I can remember, Yitzhak Arak's edition, he mentioned some documents how actually Armia Krajova was perceived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and how did they deny to help the Jews.
Yeah, this is very well documented in Zuckerman's memoirs and other places. There was no effort on the part of the Home Army to help the Jews for a variety of reasons, of course. I mean, the main and fundamental problem, I think, was the sense that Jews, this is not us. That's another business. The second, the other issue was a notion that essentially there are nuclei of communist organizations over there, and that the Jews, to the extent that they want to fight, and helping the Jews would be tantamount to providing weapons to communist insurgents. And finally, there was another issue of great importance, it seems to me. The Polish underground was not ready to wage and confront Germans, and at that time. And the notion was that if the insurgency bursts out with any kind of intensity, this may lead to this may spread to the rest of the city and so forth. But fundamental issue, of course, was I think anti-Semitism. There were conversations earlier on. Zuckerman, in particular, was a person who was a contact fellow. He actually was not inside the ghetto during the uprising itself. He was outside. He got out a few days before the uprising broke out. It was the uprising broke out because Germans came in to deport the last Jews. And he was trying to weave contacts to get, to purchase arms for the Jewish fighting organization. And it wasn't very successful. So,
good.
Yeah.
we are slowly really tired, and we have to close the building. But you wanted to say something, and you are really the very last.
I have a question. It's a question of ignorance.
Of what?
It's a question out of ignorance.
Okay.
Is there a Polish equivalent to Ernst Clay's The Good Old Days? You know, where he interviews perpetrators and bystanders. And so the question is, because I don't know the historiography in Poland, is there a similar book for Poland? And if not, do you think such a book would be possible?
A book, forgive me, it's analysis.
It was called Schöne Zeiten, The Good Old Days,
yes.
in which he brings, you know, he asks people who were there, who were active perpetrators, and I'm asking whether such a book exists for Poland, and if not, do you think a book like that would be possible for in Polish history?
They are all dead by now, so it would be possible. But there is plenty.
But in the historiography, there was nothing similar after the war.
No. And no, you know, there were no. The people who were perpetrators were very often put on trial. So we have their statements in the context of trials that have been held after the war. So it's not that perpetrators didn't speak up and we know nothing about that. But of course one speaks differently when questioned by a prosecutor than one would, I presume, if you had a conversation, then that would mean that you agreed to it and that you want to talk about it. I don't know of any such story, frankly. No.
There is after decades, a couple of years ago, a Hungarian Jewish writer wrote a kind of docu-fiction. The title is Orgy. And this goes on the very last weeks of the Holocaust atrocities and based on the people court trials. And this story was told also by the perspective of the perpetrators. And it was already translated into English. It's a very hard book, but he tried to tell somehow this perspective, the perspective of the perpetrator.
Well, actually, fascinating books of conversations with perpetrators are books about Rwanda.
Yeah.
There is French journalist, Jean Hatzfeld is his name, and he spoke with a lot when they were willing to talk to him.
Yeah. So there are some examples, but not in Poland.
Not in Poland.
Professor Gross,
thank you
dear Jan, thank you so much. It was really very, very inspiring and sometimes provoking evening, which we need. We need this type of provocation. Thank you so much, and come back to us again.
Thank you.